All right, so Pennsylvania Senate candidate John Fetterman recently wrote an op-ed where he basically just laid out his vision for the future of the country if he successfully beats Dr. Oz and wins this election. So I wanted to go ahead and read through basically the entirety of this op-ed that he wrote, because I think not only is he based and correct on pretty much all different points that he makes throughout this, but also it kind of gives us a demonstration in terms of why he's doing so well in this election against Dr. Oz. So here from the Times Leader. They say their view: to support working Pennsylvanians, we need to hold Washington accountable. So he starts off by saying, all across Pennsylvania, we're seeing soaring prices, hollowed out communities, and families getting ripped off by corporate greed. 100% true. In towns and cities across the Commonwealth, people are struggling, but too many of the people we send to Washington, D.C. don't see that because they don't care about places like ours. 100% correct. I mean, look at the makeup of Washington, D.C. politics right now. Not only do we have millionaires who, are disproportionately represented in Congress, half of our government is filled up with millionaires, if not more than that. But on top of that, they're also accepting those donations and essentially bribes from corporate America and the military industrial complex. So that's exactly who they serve. And you can see this with historically or just with recent pieces of legislation and, battles that have gone on within our government. You see this with the Inflation Reduction Act, this, historic climate bill being written by a completely corrupted fossil fuel coal baron like Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema taking that money from Big Pharma and rejecting a lot of the prescription drug price reforms that should have been in a bill like this. So many examples that we could point to, both throughout history and just recent specific examples that we've seen, demonstrating how just completely corrupt and rotten our government is and how they don't serve the interests of average people within Pennsylvania or in any state across the country. But he continues saying that working people of Pennsylvania need more real solutions that will fight inflation and bring down costs for working people, whether it's at the grocery store, the pump, or the doctor, and we need to crack down on massive corporations that are ripping us off. So kind of general there, but he's going to get into a little bit more specifics. And he says that he just released his plan to hold Washington accountable. And he says these aren't Democratic or Republican solutions. They're patriotic, pro-America and pro-worker solutions, and they're just plain common sense. And I think that's smart of him to not lean into party tribalism or anything like that, because again, if you actually are serving an agenda that is in support of improving the material conditions for average working class people, then yeah, you're not going to be strictly siding with Republicans or Democrats. You're just going to be focusing specifically on policy, and that's exactly what he does. And he says, and while my opponent, Dr. Oz, has been trying to familiarize himself with his new state and apparently with grocery stores, I've been putting in work, talking to people across the Commonwealth, and coming up with a plan that will improve the lives of working Pennsylvanians. So obviously taking a dig at Dr. Oz and that recent absolutely cringe video that he put out where he was at the grocery store and he mispronounced the name of the grocery store, and he was trying to pretend like he was just an average working class Joe who was getting hit hard by inflation and complaining and crying about how expensive crudité has gotten. So successful dig there by John Fetterman. His campaign also released a bunch of stickers that they came out with, let them eat crudité, and as well as released a bunch of advertisements blasting him for that, which, I think was pretty fair, and it was honestly, again, just embarrassing for Dr. Oz and his campaign. But he continues saying the first step of fighting inflation and bringing down costs starts with making more stuff right here in America and bringing jobs home. He says, for far too long, out-of-touch politicians in Washington have sold out people on factory floors to benefit their friends in corporate boardrooms, passing bad trade deals that have sent thousands of good-paying jobs overseas. Again, 100% correct. There's a lot of Republicans that are coming out, including Dr. Oz, who love to use the narrative of inflation and how hard it's hitting average working class families. But then when you get into their actual solutions, what is somebody like Dr. Oz actually putting on the table in terms of fighting inflation? Okay, it's completely unserious proposals. What he actually wants to do is just impose austerity on working class people, to slash government programs. Okay, we had this recent article that just came out a couple days ago about him floating the idea of putting veterans and their health care through the private health insurance exchanges instead of giving them the health care that they actually deserve. Okay, that's just a small piece of this, but on every single policy you want to talk about, Dr. Oz and the conservative ideological framework, their policy agenda for solving inflation right now is austerity for for working people. That's all that it is, okay? Slashing those government programs, privatizing Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, that's their solution to inflation, which has absolutely nothing to do with the actual primary causes of inflation that we've been feeling here in the United States. And I've been saying this for basically the entirety of since this inflationary pressure started taking off. It's been a couple different main factors. Number one were supply chain breakdowns at the beginning of COVID, and those supply chain breakdowns you can thank to the process that John Fetterman was just outlining here of decades of neoliberalism and globalization, where U.S. multinational corporations decided that it would be cheaper for them to go exploit labor and resources overseas rather than keeping domestic manufacturing jobs here in the United States. That's why they did that. They screwed you over, they shipped your jobs overseas, and that was with the help of both Democrats and Republicans. Okay, this is the problem with neoliberal global capitalism. All right, these companies, these corporations, these manufacturing companies, they don't give a single solitary shit about American workers or about even the United States as a country and what's good for this country in terms of national security or economic framework or anything like that. All they care about is returning maximum profits to their shareholders. So of course they're going to export those jobs. And he's getting to a key point here, which is again was one of the primary drivers of inflation, especially at the beginning of the pandemic: supply chain breakdowns. Why do we have insecure supply chains? Because they're overseas, because we are reliant on countries like China and other, Southeast Asian countries, as well as like some Latin American countries and countries in Africa as well. We rely on them for our global supply chain in order to extract their resources and exploit their cheap labor. Okay, so again, he's pointing out a key problem there. If you invest in domestic manufacturing, you would have much more secure supply chains, right? So when something like COVID comes around, you wouldn't feel that same shock to those supply chains. But on top of that, he gets at another point here, which is the second primary cause of inflation, which is just straight up corporate price gouging and greed from corporations who are weaponizing the narrative of inflation in order to artificially jack up their prices and screw over average Americans. But he says we'll bring back American manufacturing by punishing the companies that ship jobs overseas, strengthening Buy American requirements for companies that do business with the federal government, and mandating that companies we buy from make their products here at home. Absolutely amazing policy there. And they say while we're at it, we should crack down on companies that falsely claim their products are made here and punish them for ripping off and misleading the American people. Based and correct. He says if we make more stuff here in America, prices won't spike every time there's a problem overseas. We don't need to be outsourcing any more jobs and production to China while making inflation worse. And he says when it comes to bringing down costs for working Pennsylvanians, we can't end there. It's time that we crack down on the big price gouging corporations that are making record profits while jacking up prices for all of us. And he uses the fossil fuel industry as an example here. He says take the massive oil companies, for example. Chevron, Exxon, and Shell have seen their profits increase 200% since last year, but they're still charging us sky-high prices for gas. Companies like Tyson posted over $1 billion in profits last quarter while raising the prices on meat products our families depend on. So again, when conservatives come out here and they say, oh my God, inflation is so bad, average working class people are getting screwed over, that's why we need to slash government spending, they're bullshitting you, okay? They're lying about the primary cause of inflation, which is 100% what John Fetterman is pointing out here. Supply chain breakdowns because we don't manufacture fucking anything in the United States anymore, and corporate price gouging, these companies that are making record profits while increasing the cost at the gas pump, at the grocery store for average working class people just because they fucking can. So of course, you need to crack down on those companies who are engaging in that what should be criminal behavior. And he says we should also cut taxes for working families based and stop the ultra wealthy from abusing our broken tax code. Right now, massive companies like Amazon are simply not paying their fair share. Really, sometimes they don't even pay anything at all. And he says working people are forced to pay more as a result. It's wrong and must end. And he says we should make sure that Wall Street, hedge fund managers, and mega millionaires pay their fair share by enacting a financial transaction tax on trades of stocks, bonds, and derivatives. Again, absolutely amazing. And he says we also should cut costs for working Americans at their doctor's office and the pharmacy, and that means ending the stranglehold of healthcare costs on American families by instituting a cap of $1,000 per year on out-of-pocket costs. That would be absolutely phenomenal. A cap of $1,000 $1,000 per year for healthcare costs for average Americans, 100% would be amazing. Obviously, I believe we should completely decommodify healthcare, but this alone would be saving like millions and millions of people just, incredibly important and vital money that they shouldn't be having to dump into medical expenses. But he says they should also pass legislation to allow the importation of lower priced prescription drugs from other countries, looking at a situation where Canada or, other European countries as well are paying a tiny fraction of the price for the same exact goddamn prescription drugs simply because the US government allows these private corporations to price gouge the American people. So that as well would be an absolutely amazing policy. He says we should also put a cap on prescription drug costs and go after the pharmaceutical companies that are jacking up prices. And then he says he'll fight to hold drug companies accountable for forcing families to ration insulin as they rake in record profits and rip Pennsylvanians off. So, I mean, he's 100% correct. I think I skipped over this paragraph here, but this is also even probably the best one. He says we'll crack down on this price gouging basically by prosecuting the executives of huge corporations, including the big oil companies and meatpacking companies who are artificially driving up prices, gouging consumers at the pump and at the grocery store. So here's John Fetterman. I mean, absolutely, again, 100% based and correct on virtually every single point that he was just making there. And this is why I think that somebody like John Fetterman is doing so well against Dr. Oz, because he's actually out here talking about the real issues, right? This motherfucker is coming out here and saying we should criminally prosecute these executives at fossil fuel companies, at food companies, at any of these companies who are price gouging Americans while they're making record profits. Absolutely. These people are 100% criminals. I mean, these are the biggest financial criminals in the country right now. Okay, so calling for their prosecution, calling for even like increased enforcement or, price caps in various industries, 100% needs to be done. And so, again, I think this is why John Fetterman is doing so well against Dr. Oz, because Dr. Oz is busy, running around doing these cringe advertisements where, he blasts the fact that John Fetterman is in favor of weed legalization or whatever the fuck, and calling him a radical socialist for wanting universal health care. Meanwhile, John Fetterman is actually out there talking to real people and coming up with actual, legitimate, specific policy solutions to a lot of the problems that average people are facing right now, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country. So listen, we got to make sure that this guy wins. I would never, suggest that you donate to any politician. I'm sure that he has millions of dollars on deck, but if you want to go donate to him, do that. If you want to help organize for his campaign, do that. But, the difference between him and Dr. Oz is really honestly not even comparable. And even beyond that, having somebody like John Fetterman within the Senate, within the Democratic Party, would significantly, in my opinion, be a pretty massive shakeup that could lead to some pretty amazing and successful left-wing policy proposals like the ones that he was just outlining in that op-ed.